The entire terrace went quiet the moment the plate shattered. Warm gravy and roasted vegetables slid down the front of the man's charcoal blazer, splattering across his shirt while more than 150 guests watched from candlelit tables on the rooftop of the Vandermeer estate outside Seattle. Nobody said a word. Not because they pitied him. Because everyone wanted to see whether he would finally lose his temper. He simply glanced down at the mess, lifted the linen cloth from his lap, and calmly dabbed his sleeve before folding it neatly beside his glass. If you believe in dignity and quiet strength, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to Grace and Grit Stories. A light mist had drifted over the hills all evening, leaving the vineyards glowing silver beneath the strung lanterns. Inside the reception, though, everything looked flawless. Tall arrangements of white peonies framed the stage. A jazz trio played gently near the terrace railing. Investors and executives from across the coast filled the tables, gathered to celebrate what was being called the deal of the decade. The final approval of a massive coastal desalination and clean water infrastructure project. The agreement was valued at just over $1.2 billion. Everyone assumed the paperwork would be signed before the dessert course arrived. Most guests believed the night belonged to Ardent Coastal Group, one of the region's fastest-rising engineering firms. Their CEO, Damian Kroll, had spent months branding the evening as a milestone for the future of the Pacific Northwest. Very few people had ever heard the name Silas Rhodes. And that suited Silas perfectly. At 41, Silas avoided cameras, panels, and press purposes. He had taken over Rhodes Materials Group after his mother stepped down, and had quietly grown it into one of the largest privately held suppliers of engineered concrete and structural components on the West Coast. His company almost never advertised. It simply delivered. Without Rhodes Materials, nearly every major public works project in 3 states would grind to a halt. Yet outside the industry, hardly anyone knew who ran it. Silas preferred it that way. That night he wasn't wearing a tailored designer suit or arriving with an entourage. He had driven himself down from Tacoma in a dusty pickup after spending the morning walking the floor of his oldest casting plant. He still visited the sites every few weeks. He still knew most of the crew by their first names. His chief of staff liked to joke that he owned more work gloves than dress shirts. Before he left the plant that afternoon, Silas had made one worker a quiet promise. "Whatever happens with this contract, your line stays open." It wasn't a speech, just a promise. Across the rooftop, Danielle Pryor smoothed the hem of her jacket and watched the guests filter in. She wasn't a cruel person. She was just worn thin. At 44, Danielle had spent 19 years climbing Ardent's ladder. Every step up had cost her something. Missed holidays, a cancelled sabbatical, friendships that faded because she never had time. Tonight mattered more than anything she'd chased. If the billion-dollar agreement closed, Damian had hinted she'd finally be named Chief Operating Officer. She wanted that badly. She also needed it. Her mother's long-term care had drained nearly every dollar she'd set aside. Failure simply wasn't on the table, so when she spotted an unfamiliar man seated at the reserved leadership table, still wearing a mist-dampened jacket he hadn't bothered to swap before dinner, frustration crowded out her patience. She walked over. "Excuse me," she said politely at first. "This table is reserved." Silas smiled. "I know." She frowned. "I don't think you do." He reached into his coat. "My invitation." She barely looked at it. The paper stock seemed off. "This looks printed at home. There's been a mix-up, I'm sure." "Could be. Let me find you a seat elsewhere." "I'd rather stay." She exhaled. Guests nearby began to turn. A scene was the last thing she wanted tonight. Just then Damian strolled over. "Is there a problem here?" Danielle answered before Silas could. "This gentleman seems to have wandered into the executive section." Damian barely glanced at the invitation either. Instead he took in the damp jacket. The scuffed canvas duffel resting against the chair leg. The plain steel watch. Then he smiled. But not warmly. "We get the occasional crasher." A few executives chuckled. Silas stayed calm. "I was invited." "I'm sure that's what you tell yourself," one guest said, just loud enough to carry. Maybe he saw the open bar from the parking lot. More laughter. Silas could have set them straight. He chose not to. The dinner rolled on awkwardly. Rather than having security escort him out at once, Damian decided to make a spectacle of it. "Let him stay until we confirm his name." It sounded gracious. It wasn't. Every few minutes someone tossed out another jab. A server skipped Silas's plate entirely, assuming he wasn't really on the list. Almost no one noticed, except an older woman across the table. Her name was Margaret Ellison. She sat on the board of a regional trades education charity. Without a word, she nudged her untouched basket of rolls toward him. "I don't think they meant to pass you over," she said. He smiled. "Thank you." She shrugged. "These things happen." It was the smallest kindness in the room. But Silas remembered it. Meanwhile, Damien climbed onto the stage. He spoke smoothly about vision, integrity, trust, partnership. The words rolled across the terrace while Silas listened without a flicker of expression. Margaret noticed something odd. Every time Damien inflated one of his achievements, Silas jotted something into a slim gray notebook. Not angry scribbles. Careful ones. Specific names. Specific claims. Specific promises. As though he were quietly auditing a proposal. The main course finally came. Glasses were topped off. Photographers drifted between tables, prepping for the ceremonial signing. Danielle allowed herself to relax. Everything was back on track. Then Damien raised his glass for a final toast. To partnerships built on trust. The applause hadn't faded when one of Damien's longtime backers pushed his chair back and squeezed past Silas. He stumbled. Or so he'd claim later. His hand caught the edge of a serving plate, and the entire dish tipped forward. Gravy and roasted vegetables spilling straight down Silas's chest. Gasps rippled across the terrace. The investor laughed first. Then Damien. Someone gave a slow, mocking clap. Danielle didn't laugh. She looked away. She recognized humiliation when she saw it. Silas rose slowly. Sauce dripped onto the stone floor. One photographer instinctively lifted his camera. Another lowered his. Even they weren't certain whether this belonged in tomorrow's coverage. Silas took the folded napkin from his lap and set it neatly beside the plate. Then he looked at Damien. "I think we're done here." Damien smirked. "Agreed." Silas nodded once. "Good." He picked up his duffel. No shouting, no threats, no parting speech. He simply walked toward the terrace doors. Behind him, conversations picked right back up. The guests assumed the odd little interruption was over. None of them noticed Margaret Ellison watching him leave with a worried crease in her brow. She had a feeling the night wasn't finished. And neither was the deal. Silas reached the lobby just as the mist finally lifted. A valet hurried over with an umbrella, but he waved it off. "I'm all right." He stood under the entrance canopy a moment, staring out over the darkened hills. His phone buzzed almost at once. It was his chief of staff, Priya. "Everything set?" she asked. Silas glanced back through the reception windows. "Yes." "Want me to bring the team in?" "Give me 5 minutes." "You sure about this?" "I'm sure." He ended the call. Inside, not a single guest knew that Rhodes Materials Group wasn't just another name on the contract. It was the company underwriting nearly 40% of the fabrication, guaranteeing every delivery timeline, and providing the performance bond that all 3 lending banks had demanded before releasing a dollar. Without Rhodes Materials, there was no billion-dollar project. Back inside, Damien straightened his tie and posed for photographers. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced. "Our final signing partner should be joining us any moment now." An aide leaned in. "Sir, we're still waiting on Rhodes Materials." Damien frowned. "They're late." "It seems so." "You're certain?" "Yes." He checked his watch. "We'll wait." 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Guests began glancing at their phones. The trio quietly set down their instruments. The kitchen delayed dessert a second time. Danielle came over holding a folder. "We've tried every number." "Nothing." Straight to voicemail. Damien forced a smile. "Probably caught in traffic." Outside, the roads were already dry. Meanwhile, Silas sat quietly in his truck across the lot. He wasn't angry. Mostly just disappointed. His mother had spent 42 years building Rhodes Materials on one simple belief. Character will always outlast confidence. That principle had shaped every decision he'd ever made. He wasn't about to abandon it tonight. Priya slid into the passenger seat with a leather case. "Well?" Silas looked toward the lit-up terrace. "They showed us exactly how they treat people they think are worthless." She nodded. "Figured after your message." He opened the folder. Inside were 2 contracts. One with Ardent Coastal Group. Another with a quieter competitor called Harbor Line Engineering. Harbor Line had come in second during negotiations. They weren't glossy. Their leaders still walked their own job sites. Their founder still answered his own emails. Silas had met him twice. Both times the meeting ended with the same line. If we ever build together, we'll build something worth putting our names on. Silas trusted people who talked like that. He signed the second contract. Priya gave a small smile. I'll loop in legal. And call Harbor Line. They'll think it's a prank. Tell them it isn't. Back on the terrace, unease was steadily replacing celebration. The chair of Coastal First Lending approached Damien. We're now 25 minutes behind. We'll start shortly. The funding committee is asking questions. They'll have answers. Danielle watched Damien's polish crack for the first time all evening. Another aide rushed over holding a tablet. Sir. What now? I found something. What? The man we asked to leave. We didn't ask anyone to leave. Danielle looked at the floor. They all knew they had. The aide swallowed. His invitation was real. Damien rolled his eyes. Then whose was it? The aide turned the screen. At the top, Rhodes Materials Group. Below it, Silas Rhodes, owner and chief executive officer. Silence. Total silence. Danielle felt her stomach drop. No. The aide nodded. Yes. Someone whispered. That's him. Another executive stared at the doors. The man with the plate. Nobody finished the thought. They didn't need to. Damien grabbed his phone. Call him. We have. No answer. He declined. Again. Declined again. Danielle closed her eyes. For 19 years she had studied deals. One truth kept surfacing in her mind. People rarely remember the figures. They always remember how you made them feel. Nearly 40 minutes later, the terrace doors opened again. The room fell quiet. Silas walked back in. His jacket had been changed. The stains were gone. He wore no look of triumph, only composure. Behind him came 6 members of the Rhodes Materials leadership team. Several guests stood on their own. Not because anyone told them to, because now they understood exactly who had just entered. Damien hurried forward. Mr. Rhodes. Silas shook his head gently. Silas is fine. I owe you an apology. You do. It was a misunderstanding. It wasn't. Damien hesitated. Silas went on evenly. You understood perfectly well what you thought I was. No one argued. No one could. Danielle stepped up next. I'm sorry. Unlike Damien, she didn't reach for an excuse. I judged you before I ever spoke to you. Silas looked at her for a long, quiet moment. I appreciate the honesty. She nodded once. I don't expect forgiveness. That's not really the point. Then what is? The point is culture. He looked around the terrace. $1 billion partnership isn't built on presentations. He glanced toward the stage. It's built on how people are treated when no one thinks they matter. No microphone carried his voice, yet everyone heard every word. Margaret Ellison smiled quietly. She'd sensed something unusual about him from the start. Not because he looked wealthy. Because genuinely secure people rarely need everyone else to know it. The bank chair approached carefully. Mr. Rhodes, are we moving ahead with the signing? Silas reached into his case. Everyone assumed he was pulling out the contract. Instead he produced a different folder. Blue, not gray. My company has made a different choice. Executives exchanged nervous glances. Silas continued. This afternoon Rhodes Materials signed with Harbor Line Engineering. The room went impossibly still. The financing, the fabrication guarantees, the logistics, the performance bond. All of it has been redirected. Someone near the back whispered. The deal's gone. Silas nodded politely. It is. No celebration, no revenge. Just a business decision. Damien looked genuinely hollow. You've cost us everything. Silas answered quietly. No, you did. You lost it before I ever sat down. Those words hung in the air longer than any speech could have. As guests began gathering their things, Silas walked toward the exit again. Then he stopped beside Margaret. Thank you. She looked surprised. For what? You shared your bread. She laughed softly. It was only rolls. It wasn't. He reached into his pocket and handed her a small envelope. Inside was a handwritten note. Rhodes Materials was donating $2 million to her Trades Education Foundation in memory of his mother. At the bottom he had written a single line. Because kindness deserves investment too. Margaret folded the note carefully. This will change hundreds of lives. I hope so. Before he left, Silas stopped by Danielle one final time. I meant what I said. She looked down. I know. You made a mistake. I did. What matters now is who you decide to become after tonight. She nodded quietly. Months later, after leaving Ardent, Danielle took a leadership role at a nonprofit that trained young people from struggling neighborhoods for careers in skilled trades and project management. She often told new managers that leadership wasn't measured by the people who impressed you. It was measured by the people you assumed had nothing to offer. She never mentioned Silas by name. She didn't have to. The lesson stayed with her every single day. Harbor Line finished the project 2.5 years later, ahead of schedule. And more importantly, every worker at Silas's oldest casting plant kept the jobs he'd promised to protect. That promise meant far more to him than standing under lights in front of cameras. If this story moved you, please leave a like and share it with someone who still believes character matters. Comment respect is priceless. If you believe a single moment of decency can change a person's life, sometimes the biggest opportunities aren't lost to bad luck or tough competition. They're lost in ordinary moments. When we decide what someone is worth before we've bothered to learn who they really are. Kindness costs almost nothing, but respect can be worth far more than $1 billion deal.